So, in this podcast, we're going to take a look here briefly at the portrait of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel, or its Christology. So, there are four elements to Matthew's portrait of Jesus as Messiah. We have his portrait of him as the Son of David, as Emmanuel, as Son of Man, and as Son of God. So, first of all, we'll begin with Son of David. So this is the designation of Jesus in Matthew's prologue, and David's descent is emphasized in the genealogy with its structure and its division, especially into 14 names. The David's name is in Hebrew is three letters, and so those three letters, each letter has a numerical value, and the numerical value of David's name is 14. So it's kind of interesting that we have these three sets in the genealogy of 14. So the title Son of Man was really not used for the Messiah in Jewish texts until actually quite late. Some people may find that quite surprising that, there must have been before Jesus, lots of Jews who were thinking about the Messiah in terms of this title, but really not until the Psalms of Solomon do we find this title being used. But a David Messiah was probably expected both at Qumran and according to various Jewish prayers and in certain synagogues. So we see this. It is kind of interesting as well, talking about the genealogy, that if you look carefully at Matthew's genealogy, what we really have in the genealogy is the ancestry of Joseph. But then Matthew makes it clear that Joseph is not Jesus's biological father. Now, he's Mary's child, who conceives miraculously by the Holy Spirit. So she did not know her husband, not sexual relationship. So this is not biologically Joseph's child, but that's who the genealogy is. So the genealogy doesn't show the bloodline of Jesus; it shows the bloodline of Joseph. But Jesus is adopted, as it were, into Joseph's line. So if it had been Mary's, ancestry, well, then you could say the bloodline of David goes through to Mary to reach Jesus. So the emphasis is not so much that Jesus is biologically connected to David, but that this from David to this particular time, the Messiah is going to be born according to a divine plan. So in particular, Matthew stresses Jesus as son of David, who miraculously heals Israel's sickness, especially blindness. Now, we'll see the healing of blindness in several places in Matthew's gospel. Of course, blindness is symbolic oftentimes of ignorance. So here, the son of David is coming to heal Israel's sickness. Now, again, this is quite curious because David is primarily seen as a military leader. He's not known as a healer. And the Messiah is not particularly known as someone who heals people of diseases. And yet that is the presentation that you have of Jesus in Matthew's gospel, as well as the other gospels. So he is son of David who heals. Now, Jesus' question about the Messiah as David's son really points to the Pharisees' incapability to discern Jesus' true identity. So you might think about Jesus as son of David, but that's not sufficient enough. I mean, it's good to think of him as son of David, and he is son of David, but something about the Pharisees' inability to understand how Jesus could be son of David is exposed there in that one text. So the other concept we find in Matthew's gospel is the idea of him being Emmanuel, Jesus as Emmanuel, occurs again in kind of the birth narrative at the beginning, and explains how God is with his people. So, of course, this language of Jesus being Emmanuel is picking off a prophecy in Isaiah, a prophecy that is really fulfilled by the birth of Hezekiah. But Matthew sees in this a fuller fulfillment in the birth of Jesus. And just as God was going to be with his people in Judah when they were circled around by different enemies and they were tempted to make these alliances to protect themselves, but they are to trust that God is going to protect them. So too now God is with his people, the followers of Jesus, and it's through Jesus that he is present with his people. And so he's explains that Jesus is with his people. They are to be obedient to God, and they are to live in anticipation of God's kingdom. So it's interesting there with 28 and verse 20 also that it ends. So Jesus tells his disciples, "Lo, I am with you always." So at the very beginning of the book, we have the idea of God being with his people. And then at the end, Jesus is with his disciples. There is, in Matthew's gospel, no ascension of Jesus up into the heavens. So we just have the risen Jesus who is present with, spiritually in some way with his people. The Emmanuel image then illustrates Matthew's attempt to focus Old Testament theology in this portrait. So this idea of God being with his people and God saving his people and delivering his people while they are surrounded by their enemies. Since the Emmanuel concept frames Matthew's gospel, it points to how his Jesus story, this is quoting from Erlich Lutz's studies in Matthew, Jesus' story is the new story of God's presence with his people. So in this new way, God is demonstrating that he is with his people by what Jesus is doing. Then we have the phrase Son of Man. So Son of Man sayings are non-existent in Matthew's Gospel prior to 8:20. So we basically have the Sermon on the Mount for chapters 5 through 7. But then when you get into 8, that's when we'll first see the phrase Son of Man, and it will appear significantly in other places. So in the confession by Peter, it'll show up there. And then later on, it'll show up in Jesus' discourse. So Jesus speaks exclusively to his disciples about the Son of Man after the confession, with the exception of 26:64. So Son of Man is just revealed to the disciples. And the predominant emphasis then is on his coming, his suffering, and his rising. One exception is the phrase Son of Man that's found in Matthew 12:40. Matthew also has sayings about the exalted status of the Son of Man. So anyway, he has that. But Jesus, as the Son of Man, is primarily the eschatological judge. Especially, he's the judge of Jesus' opponents, where Jesus said, "You'll see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." So, but it is interesting how Son of Man then is kind of played as a judge in Matthew's gospel, and how the Son of Man takes on more significance. So if Matthew has Mark's gospel, Mark has Son of Man, but Matthew seems to have quite a bit. So several of the Son of Man sayings that appear in Matthew, but not in Mark, have to do with the coming of the Son of Man. So this idea of him coming, his arrival, his parousia, which again is imperial language. So we talk about the emperor appearing or coming to a city or town. His arrival indicates his sovereignty over that city. So too, with Jesus' appearing or his coming, shows his sovereignty over the earth. And then we have Son of God. So with Son of God, Jesus is introduced frequently in the prologue as Son of God, and with a particular emphasis that God is the one who reveals Jesus as his Son. So not that Jesus is revealing himself as Son of God, but God is the one who reveals that. This sonship then is evidenced by his obedience to God's will. So Israel too is God's son, but Israel is the disobedient son, whereas Jesus then is the obedient one. The title Son of God then is used in significant points in the structure of the gospel. So you just kind of take note again in these different places where it shows up. So the gospel, in one sense, structures itself around this idea. Matthew 11, 25 through 30, again, the confession 16 and 17 are keys to understanding Matthean Son of God Christology. Because they have a simultaneous emphasis on God's revelation of Jesus' identity and on his life of obedience. So, in what way has Jesus shown that he is God's Son? He is shown through obedience. And this is important for Matthew's gospel. Matthew's gospel is going to stress that the disciples have to be obedient to Jesus. So, the disciples truly want to learn from Jesus, then they have to be obedient to God's will. To God's law. So whereas Mark's gospel emphasizes Son of God and Son of Man in the context of Jesus's suffering and his death, Matthew is emphasizing Son of God around the issue of obedience. And so that's a brief look at some of the key kind of titles associated with Matthew's portrait or Matthew's portrait of Jesus or his Christology. And so that'll just give you a brief taste of that.